In addition to all of the cellular components of the blood, there's also the non-cellular part, which is the liquid portion. This is called the plasma. This fluid is straw or light yellow colored and is somewhat viscous. Blood gets its red color from the red blood cells. But plasma consists of water and a number of proteins. Of this, the important portion of the proteins that we want to concern ourselves with is what's called the globulin fraction. This is particularly important to the function of the immune system, especially a section that's called the gamma globulin. This contains most of the antibodies our body produces in response to infectious disease. Antibodies have lots of different jobs with an effective immune response, including neutralization of antigens and toxins from microbes, and also recruiting immune components to act on bound antigens. Other protein components of the plasma include complement proteins. Complement proteins are a significant defense mechanism against potential disease-causing microbes. These are made in an inactive form and are activated as part of the innate defenses. Complement is a system of biological amplification, and it helps amplify or increase the strength of the immune response in three ways. One way is that it can lead to chemotaxis of phagocytes, basically attracting phagocytes like the neutrophils and monocytes to a location where there are lots of microbes. This can initiate inflammation or the inflammatory response. Secondly, complement proteins can enhance phagocytosis and encourage microbes to be engulfed by those white blood cells. Finally, complement proteins can bring about lysis on their own and destroy microbial cells by generating holes in their membranes. Another protein found in blood plasma is interferon. Interferons can inhibit viral replication. They are produced from viral infected cells, and just before those viral infected cells die, they release interferons, which signals to nearby cells that there are viruses in the body. The nearby white blood cells can then respond to this viral infection a lot more effectively. The immune system relies heavily on a system of organs in the body known as the lymphatic system. It is anatomically connected to the blood circulatory system, which is very similar, but is different in that the blood circulatory system contains red blood cells. The lymphatic system, on the other hand, is a series of tubes, much like the blood circulatory system, that carries lymph. Lymph is a tissue fluid derived from blood, but without the red blood cells. It is collected by the lymphatic vessels, which then open into the blood circulatory system, allowing return of the lymphatic fluid to the blood circulatory system. The blood system is driven by a pump, the heart, and is a true circulatory system in that it is enclosed and it moves throughout the body. The lymphatic system, on the other hand, moves lymph without the assistance of a pump. It also goes in only one direction, from the extremities back to the core of the body, where it dumps the lymphatic fluid back into the blood circulatory system. The way this fluid moves through the lymphatic system is using skeletal muscle movements. Just by moving around and using your muscles, this squeezes the lymphatic system vessels and pushes the lymph fluid back to the blood circulatory system. One-way valves in the lymph vessels also allow the fluid to only go in one direction. Along the path of these lymphatic vessels are lymph nodes, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Now, where does all of the blood cells come from? They come from what are referred to as primary immune structures. Primary immune structures include the bone marrow. This is the major site of blood cell formation, otherwise known as hematopoiesis. Blood cells are short-lived, and they have to be continuously generated from hematopoietic stem cells, which are located in the bone marrow of the skull, ribs, sternum, vertebrae, pelvis, and femurs. These are stem cells and divide through your entire life, generating new cell lines the entire time. There are two pathways of blood cell maturation: the myeloid path and the lymphoid path. The myeloid lineage leads to lymphocytes, B cells, T cells, and natural killer cells, whereas the myeloid lineage leads to essentially all of the other blood cells that we've discussed. When the B cells leave the bone marrow, they enter circulation and are totally functional. That's because B cells are born in the bone marrow and mature in the bone marrow. This is why they're called B cells. T cells, on the other hand, are born in the bone marrow, just like all other blood cells, but then migrate to the thymus, where they mature there. Let's talk about the thymus. The thymus is different than the thyroid. The thymus is an organ located behind the sternum, just above the heart. When the T cells leave the thymus, they go to secondary or peripheral lymphoid tissues, and that's where they function. At birth, the thymus is a relatively large organ and attains its maximum size by puberty. The early years are ones that really rely on the thymus, and this is when numerous childhood diseases and also immunizations like vaccines are experienced. It is during these early years that the immune system is maturing, and the thymus plays a significant role as the training ground for building the repertoire and variety of T cells that you'll have your entire life. After adolescence, the thymus gradually degenerates, and by late adulthood, it's mostly fatty tissue, with very little lymphoid tissue remaining. This has led some doctors to claim that the thymus is important in children and less important in adults, because if it is removed for any reason in a child, it does lead to potentially life-threatening infections later on in life. But if it's removed from an adult, it generally has no consequence. Secondary or peripheral lymphoid tissues are tissues that include the spleen, tonsils, adenoids, lymph nodes, and patches of lymph tissue associated with the intestinal tract. Frequent sites of infection are the connective tissues, which can become infected with microbes as a result of skin or mucous membrane injury. This is usually how you would acquire an infectious disease. The connective tissue is a network of open-ended lymphatic vessels that collect the extracellular lymph fluid. The lymph is plasma that continually leaks out of the blood vessels and into the tissues. Lymphatic vessels in the periphery connect to larger lymph vessels, ultimately returning that fluid, as we mentioned, to the blood circulatory system. In order to keep microbes from entering the lymph fluid and then being carried to the blood circulatory system, which could result in a deadly infectious disease in the blood, there are filtration systems along the way. These filters are known as lymph nodes, They are essentially the size of a pea and are stationed along the lymphatic vessels to filter the lymph fluid and remove any potential microbes that may exist there before those microbes get to end up in the blood circulatory system. The lymph nodes also contain B cells and T cells, and thus allow for the destruction of microbes trapped there. If the infection begins in blood rather than connective tissue, it's important to act fast. That's what the spleen is used for. The spleen kind of acts like a filtration system for the blood, much like the lymph node does for the lymphatic system. It has matured B and T cells, as well as phagocytic cells like monocytes and neutrophils that can help with elimination of microbes from the blood. The spleen is a spongy fist-sized organ, so located in the upper left portion of the abdominal cavity. It is therefore much larger than a single lymph node, but there's only one spleen, whereas there are many lymph nodes scattered throughout the body. Because of its location and its relatively thin connective tissue covering, it is subject to injury, such as might happen in a car accident or a sports injury. Severe trauma to that organ can result in its rupture and severe hemorrhaging, necessitating its removal in a splenectomy. Splenectomy patients may not be able to respond as quickly to infections in the blood, and as such, a patient who has had their spleen removed needs to be very aware of any signs of an infection and should always be up to date on vaccinations. Other common locations for microbial infections are the mucous surfaces of the respiratory or gastrointestinal tracts. We have multiple lymphoid aggregates in those sites. The tonsils and adenoids are located in the back of the throat, just in front of the pharynx. Their lymphocytes play a role in protection against microbes entering through the nose and throat. A generation or so back, it was routine for young children to have their tonsils removed and a tonsillectomy. But this is no longer a common procedure because antibiotics help treat a lot of these ailments. Patches of lymphoid tissues are distributed in the lining of the gastrointestinal and respiratory tracts as well. In the small intestine, these collections are known as Peyer's patches, and they help fend off microbes ingested in the digestive tract. Let's talk about immune function, starting with innate immunity. Innate immunity was originally thought to be nonspecific, and it still generally is. However, the different components of the innate immune system target slightly more specific components than just microbes in general. It is therefore not nearly as precise as adaptive immune system, but it does take into account the type of infection, so viral versus bacterial versus fungus. And the innate defenses recognize and respond to viral infections differently than they would a bacterial infection. So they're not completely nonspecific, but they're still generally nonspecific, especially in relative comparison to the adaptive immune system. The other important characteristic about the innate immune system is that it is innate, or present from birth. It does not change too much over the lifetime of an individual. It does not get stronger or weaker. They basically respond exactly the same each and every time the same microbe is encountered. Adaptive immunity, that we'll talk about in a moment, takes much longer to develop, though it is more exact and works faster and stronger after development. We'll talk a little bit more about innate immunity in the next section.